negotiation is to give something in order to get something. And if you don't give, you won't get. So there's a lot of stupidity in diplomatic negotiation as well. And that's maybe not because of the diplomats. It is because of the politicians. The diplomats often are much wiser. So the past in negotiation can overshadow the present. And that is really a difference with business negotiation. And if the past overshadows the present, we cannot have a common future. At the moment, Talleyrand says to Napoleon, Your Majesty, you have a problem. Napoleon said, I have no problem. He said, yeah, you have a problem. You are a military genius. Countries don't want to have strong international organizations. They need international organizations, but they should not be too strong. If you don't change the context first, you can never have a negotiated opportunity. So the smaller you are, the more you have to look for opportunities, the more art is involved, the more creativity is involved. Times, yes, small countries can be more effective than bigger countries. Small countries need more effective negotiators. Big countries, if the negotiator is not effective, so what? They're powerful enough, positive. The only problem is that to start working together often only happens after a major disaster. And we don't want that disaster to happen.
Hello. Today I have a very special guest, Dr. Paul Meerts from the Netherlands, one of the most distinguished scholar in the field of diplomatic negotiations, and also very distinguished trainer in this field. And he is also the author of the wonderful book, Diplomatic Negotiation, Essence and Evolution. I strongly recommend this book to anyone who is interested in diplomatic negotiation. So welcome. Very good to see you, Paul.
Thank you. Rahmat.
Thank you so much.
May I first of all say that you are a very old friend. We met a long time ago. We are cooperating already for some 30 years now. And my first time in Central Asia was 1995. And I've been around, and we had many of the diplomats of Central Asia and Mongolia at Clingendael Institute already from 1994 onwards.
Let me start from a basic question. Do you think that negotiation is the core or essence of diplomacy?
Yeah, I think it is, but it's not the only aspect of diplomacy, of course, because diplomacy is also bureaucracy, internal decision-making in ministries with certain outcomes or between ministries. And that's not always about negotiation. That's about Mr. Trump telling his underlings what they should do. And although he wrote a book, The Art of the Deal, although he didn't write the book because it was an interview actually by a guy called Tony Schwartz. But you know, that is also part of diplomacy. But Nicholson, Harold Nicholson, a famous author and a famous negotiator as well, he said, well, diplomacy is negotiation. I do not fully agree with that. There are other aspects as well, but it is at the core. I agree with you.
All right. What do you think? What does diplomatic negotiation have that other type of negotiations do not?
Well, I think if we would make a distinction between, let's say, private sector negotiation, so business negotiation, and public sector negotiation. And in public sector negotiation, yeah, diplomacy is extremely important. The question is, of course, if civil servants are negotiating in Brussels, do you call that also diplomatic negotiation because they are not diplomats? I would call that diplomatic negotiation because it's international, because it's between states at that level. Now, the difference between the two, to me, is that in diplomatic negotiation, you negotiate about words. In other words, you negotiate about language. You negotiate about the meaning of words. And we could agree on a word. Well, your interpretation of the word will be completely different from my interpretation. Or we might have different versions of the official text. So we're playing with words, we are playing with language. It gives us a lot of opportunities, but also a lot of problems. In that sense, it's more emotional than private sector negotiation between companies. In the end, you negotiate about figures. It's about that. It's more clear cut. There is not much room, space for questions of emotions, and it isn't always long term. And companies might have a one-time deal, and whatever, even if they have more deals, states don't go away. This is a very long-term process. And so another difference here is that the point of the future and the past in diplomatic negotiation is much more of a point than in business negotiation. So let me give you an example. For example, about the shadow of the past between Azerbaijan and Armenia, right? It's not just a conflict about Nagorno-Karabakh. It is about what happened to the Armenians in Western Armenia, being today Eastern Turkey, in 1915 and before and after. It is about that. So the Armenians in Karabakh do not only see the Azeris as their opponents, but they also see them as those who killed their ancestors before, although they are not Ottoman Turks, but they are Turks. And then, of course, these atrocities of the past still play a role. Look at Israel, Palestine at the moment. People are all the time referring to the Shoah, all the time referring to the Holocaust. So the past in negotiation can overshadow the present, and that is really a difference with business negotiation. And if the past overshadows the present, we cannot have a common future. And in the European Union, one way or another, the Germans and the French managed to deal with that past, even if they don't agree on what happened. But they managed to deal with it, and therefore they have a common future. Standing on the genocide monument in Yerevan, looking west at Mount Ararat, and that's in Turkey, as you know, Erdogan at the time said to the Armenians, let's create a committee of historians to look into the past, to look into the 1915, what the Armenians call, and I would call it as well, but the Turks will never call it like that, a genocide. And the Armenians said, no, we are not going to talk with those who killed our ancestors. This is our trauma, and we will keep the trauma inside. We are not going to get rid of that trauma. So the trauma, which is a blockage for Armenia to be successful, to be rich or whatever, no, they don't want it. They rather be poor than to talk to those people who killed their ancestors so long time ago. And so you see that it was impossible to have a deal between Azerbaijan and Armenia because of the emotional side of the whole thing. Well, it's in a way it's stupid, because why shouldn't you do that? And there was a minister, Armenian minister, in 1999, Sarkisyan. He made a deal with Aliyev. He made a deal with Azerbaijanis. You know what happened with the guy? They killed him in the Armenian parliament because the constituency couldn't accept the outcome. The constituency is important for democratic negotiators. They have to deal with their bosses, their parliaments, their trade unions, their public opinion. That's what they have to deal with. It's much more easy for dictators. And they killed Sarkisyan and they killed Rabin. If you cannot convince your constituency, you're nowhere. They knew it would happen. You already knew 20 years before it would happen, because Azerbaijan is much richer. Couldn't be negotiated. They knew that they should have the Germans at the table in Versailles at the Paris negotiations, 1919, end of the First World War. They knew they should have the Germans there. And the Prime Minister of France said, Clemenceau said, I don't want the Germans at the table because millions of French died. I will lose my position if I invite them to the table. So I don't do that. And then Jean Monnet, the young assistant of the Prime Minister, and later on, one of the fathers of the European Union said, if you don't do it, we have another world war in 20 years' time. They knew, and they couldn't change it. Very sad.
Well, does it mean that on the one hand, our emotions emotional charges of diplomatic negotiation, but on the other hand, interests of the state, they could be not always go well with each other.
Exactly. So this is why I coined the idea, the term negotiation,
Right.
where the ego of the leader is more a priority than the interests of his country. And I'm afraid with Trump, probably also with Vladimir Putin, it's a lot of negotiation we see. It's not in the interest of their country. The whole invasion of Ukraine is in the end not in the interest of Russia, because even if the Ukrainians would want to have a normal relationship with Russians, after the Holodomor, it was already difficult. After the Russians, Stalin had this hunger repression in Ukraine. That already is a trauma in Ukrainian soul. And now you have this war, this aggression on top of it. Do you ever think that there will be normal relations between Russians and Ukrainians who are so close? Maybe not so close in language. Ukrainian language is closer to Polish than to Russian, but they have a history, common history together. In that sense, it's a kind of civil war. You destroy the future of the two countries if you invade them like that. Don't do that. Wait till Zelensky, who's not popular at all, is gone. There are new elections, and then try to influence if you would be Mr. Putin. But this attack, he thought he would be successful in 3 days. Completely stupid. So there's a lot of stupidity in diplomatic negotiation as well. And that's maybe not because of the diplomats. It is because of the politicians. The politicians who don't know much about diplomacy, don't care about diplomacy, care about their constituencies. The diplomats often are much wiser. So a British diplomat said about Brexit, it's very bad because if you're not at the table, you will be on the menu. So we have to be at the table. And if we want to prevent war, if we want to prevent that, then we should use words. But how to do that?
Do you see any negotiation prospects in the Russian-Ukraine war and also in the Middle East crisis?
Well, Russian-Ukraine war, in a way, is more easy to solve than Palestine-Israel. But let me start then with Russia-Ukraine. About 2 years ago, I wrote an article together with Daniel Druckmann, a famous professor from the US, who's living in Australia, I think. And we said, well, at a certain moment, there might be, as William Zartman, a professor from Washington, as you know, said, a mutual hurting stalemate, a situation where both sides say, we cannot win this war, there's so much destruction, let's start to talk. And I'm quite sure that they are talking with each other, probably in Istanbul, their former holy city, Byzantium. Anyway, at a certain moment, there might be such a situation, and hopefully a mutual enticing opportunity, which means a way out, which means often a mediator stepping in. But are we there already? Well, we think that maybe at the moment, the line might be the ceasefire line. If that will be the ceasefire line, especially if Trump goes on supporting Ukraine, but at the same time uses his influence on Putin to get a deal, then this might be a North-South Korean situation with an armistice, with a ceasefire line, no official treaty that might take another 10 years or whatever, but then you create some stability, then it is possible to deal with each other in a peaceful way. So there might be reparations later on. The Russians, they do not really understand why the Ukrainians want to be independent. When the Soviet Union broke up, the advisors of Yeltsin said to him, Mr. President, you should not lose Ukraine. At least you should keep Ukraine close to Russia. And Yeltsin said, no problem. Let Ukraine be independent. They are our brothers. They will come back to us voluntarily. So negotiation is human business. It's about perceptions. Perception determines reality. So we might see next year, I hope we will see a freezing of this present situation. It does mean that Zelensky will have to give up Crimea and eastern Ukraine, because negotiation is to give something in order to get something. And if you don't give, you won't get. And I had in class in Tallinn last month, half of the class were Ukrainians. They understood negotiation. They understood there should be an end to this war, but they could not agree that Ukraine should give up 1 inch of its territory. It's very painful, but I think it's less painful than war. And on Israel, Palestine, that's even more difficult to me because they are connected so much that you cannot disconnect them. And so either at the moment you commit genocide on the Gazans who have no way to get out because the Egyptians don't let them in. The Saudis are not helping them. At least the Karabachi from Artsakh, they could flee to Armenia and have shelter there, the 120,000. But these are many more people. What is it, about 2 million? And there is no way out. There's a very interesting book by Naomi Klein. And Naomi Klein is, as you know, professor in Canada, Jewish herself. And the name of the book is Doppelganger. So actually that's a German word, Doppelganger. What she says is Palestinians and Israelis, Jews and Arabs, they're the mirror image. They recognize themselves in each other. They are so close, even closer than Ukrainians and Russians, that you cannot detach them. They are linked like that, right? And how to deal with that? Because either you destroy the other side, that is the only option, or you live, and that's the other option, live peacefully together. Why not one Palestine with everybody in Palestine having equal rights? Why not? What's the problem? I understand the problem, but on the other hand, you know, the Second World War, this is many years ago, huh? Without Adolf Hitler, probably Israel would not exist. So, the past again, that's extremely difficult. As long as the extremists on both sides are in power, there will be no deal.
You published several papers about entrapment.
Yeah.
So perhaps we see all this entrapment process.
Absolutely. Mutual
is
entrapment.
A part of the whole.
Yeah, mutual entrapment.
Yeah.
They both entrap themselves. And it's very difficult to get rid of that. Very interesting. We have a book on, and I think you're participating in the book about famous negotiators by Remy Smolinski next year. And together with Bill Zartman from Washington, I wrote the first chapter on Talleyrand. And Talleyrand, to me, who was the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Napoleon Bonaparte, is the most interesting negotiator and diplomat of all negotiators. If you study his life,
the prince of negotiation.
Yeah, I mean, this is amazing, huh? And what he is, and that's the title also of the chapter, he's firm but flexible. So he's firm on interest and on power, and he's flexible on people and process. That, to me, is the profile of the effective negotiator. At a certain moment, Talleyrand says to Napoleon, Your Majesty, you have a problem. Napoleon said, I have no problem. He said, yeah, you have a problem. You are a military genius. Napoleon says, but that's no problem. He said, yes, a problem. Because you go from victory to victory to victory, and in the end, to defeat. Because you don't stop being victorious. You entrap yourself, and you will destruct yourself at the very end. That is entrapment. Unbelievable. And so he foresaw this many, many years before the downfall of Napoleon. And he understood that Napoleon entrapped himself, and he could not deal with France in another way. So when Napoleon said, when the Allies entered France after the People's Battle at Leipzig, Napoleon begged Talleyrand to negotiate with the enemies, especially Tsar Alexander, because in the meantime, Talleyrand had excellent relations with the enemies, with not only Alexander, but also Metternich, the Chancellor of Austria. And Talleyrand said, no, I'm not going to do that, because if I'm successful, you will remain in power in France. And if you remain in power in France, you cannot stop yourself, and you will start to conquer other territories again. And that's not good for you, and that's not good for France.
Interesting. You have written that in interstate relations, the role of diplomat is declining. But at the same time, the role of diplomacy is increasing. Could you please explain this?
Yeah, the question is, why are there so many experts, civil servants, but also academics, for example, like you and me, involved in this? So in that sense, the field of diplomacy expanding. More and more non-diplomats are active in the field. I think that has to do with the fact that the world is interdependent. Of course, in the past already, in regions like Central Asia, in regions like Europe, there was a lot of interdependency. As one of the reasons why we had the Westphalia Treaty, things like that, to put an end to wars in Europe and to keep the Turks out. But because of the more interdependency, we need more words. We need more peaceful solution of problems and of conflicts. And this means expansion of diplomacy. Well, at the same time, there is not only more hanging together and more dependency and dependent on each other, but there are also, especially now, more frictions. There's more competition. Look at the trade wars coming up, also between Europe and the United States. So there is not only more interdependency, there's also more friction. There's more opposition. So there's more collaboration, and there is more competition in strategic terms. And this is why we need a broader field. But the question then is that expanded field of diplomacy, is that the answer to all our problems? And clearly it isn't, because war is on the table again, and diplomacy is helpless. And all those books, and all those articles, and all those conceptual books, not only the how to do books on negotiation, but also the conceptual books, all those academics who thought that they knew how to deal with these conflicts in a diplomatic way, they don't know how to do this now. We don't know. We know we are helpless. So yes, diplomacy is becoming more important, becoming much more complex, much more complexity, and therefore more difficult. But at the same time, there are more problems, there are more disconnection. There's a very interesting book about connection that says that the more the world grows together, the more connections there will be. And that can be good, but can also be bad, because there will be more shortcuts, there will be more short circuits, there will be more conflict because of these connections. And then maybe it can be handled. It's a disadvantage, but as our football player Johan Cruyff said, every disadvantage has an advantage. And I think this is what the diplomats should try to do, to grab the advantages. But we are up to a lot of problems.
Now we see the use of more and more digital tools, digital practices in diplomacy, and including artificial intelligence. What do you think, how all this will affect diplomatic negotiations?
Well, I mean, it has advantages and disadvantages again. The advantages, of course, preparation for diplomats is much more easy now. For diplomats to prepare, it's much more easy if they use artificial intelligence. It will help to understand the other party, perhaps. And in negotiation, it's very much about empathy, understanding the other party. Empathy doesn't mean sympathy, that's something else. But this might help because we will have more facts and we will understand perception a little better, bit better. That's the advantage. The disadvantage is negotiation remains a human issue, a human business with all the characters around, all the different views of the leaders. And emotions are important, and that cannot be done through artificial intelligence. Emotions have two sides again. They can be negative, look at the past, but it can also be positive because it helps for people to connect with each other. So in that sense, I think the face-to-face won't go away. And the problem of all the modern means of technology is that you can directly, being the boss, being the minister, influence your ambassador at the table. And this is sometimes what an ambassador doesn't need. Because as you know from your experience as an ambassador in the UK and the EU, in Brussels, you need some space, you need some freedom, you need some possibilities to be, I would say, artistic. And it's this question of the art and science of negotiation, Howard Rafa. Is it an art or is it a science? Well, Trump says it's the art of the deal. It's art, meaning me, Trump. I'm born a good negotiator. And we say, no, we have seminars on negotiation and we can learn also. It's also science, right? But this art side is important. And if you limit the space of negotiators and you limit their creativity, it will be even more difficult to reach an agreement. And this is why we are missing the Brits in Europe, because they are the masters of this, what we call constructive ambiguity, that you'll find in between solutions. And you often need that. And it does mean that you will have a problem in implementing your agreement, but at least the diplomats did their job and they are well paid for it. And then, yeah, okay, then there will be the future, but it will be much more difficult if you know too much sometimes to strike a deal. It's really a dilemma. And I think, in essence, if you look at negotiation, you can compare negotiation with water. It's fluent, it's flexible, but at the same time, it needs to be contained. Like water in a river, the water in the river has to go to the end stage, being the sea. It needs borders. It needs, kind of obstacles. And we see that in international institutions. International institutions are the borders of the negotiation process. And because of them, because of this restraint, they can, in the end, maybe be successful. In other words, what I sometimes say to students about European Union is the glass, the water is the negotiation process. Without the water, it wouldn't work. But without the glass, you couldn't drink it. You could not be effective. And so it's very important for negotiation to be effective and therefore to have this protection. But disadvantages, international organizations often have their own interest and often an obstacle in itself. So it's not so easy. And what you, Alisher, when you write about Tcid negotiation, to me, that's very much about the context of negotiation. You can negotiate without negotiating. And this is what Richelieu said, the prime minister in France a very long time ago. He said, you should negotiate already when you don't need to negotiate. In other words, you have to have your network in order, you have to have your context in order, that in case you need to negotiate, you have the ways to influence the other party.
Paul, you are quite famous with your negotiation trainings. You provided negotiation trainings for diplomats, I believe, in about 100 countries or so. So you are doing this for a long time. Do you see any trend, new trends in this field? What's going on in this field of diplomatic training or negotiation training for diplomats? Anything
not really.
we could
Sorry? Not really. And even if you would talk about research, I think it's very difficult to find new areas where we can shed light on negotiation, because more or less everything has been said, I think. Everything has been done. But all those academics will have to go on to produce books and papers. So how to do that? But the same is true for training. And I just came last week from Bruges, where we have the European Diplomatic Academy. It's a new thing, etc., etc. What we are doing there is exactly the same as what we were doing 30 years ago. when there was a kind of European diplomatic program in Europe. No, it doesn't really change. There are different ways to approach training. Many trainers use a lot of pictures, so to speak, right? At times of the overhead, we always said, if you can't use your head, use overhead. So I try to work with my mouth and my hands and so on, face to face, because I still think that's the best way to reach the people around the table and to have discussions with them on an individual basis, even if you are in with the collective whole, and that human aspect doesn't go away. And if you're talking over the heads of the participants, then you get nowhere. So in the end, it's very much about the personal connection. And then if there is a diplomat or whatever from, let's say, Hungary, there was a diplomat from Hungary, or there was a diplomat from Spain. And so I had a discussion with him because he said, Gibraltar. I said, Gibraltar, it's still a sour point, isn't it, in Spain? It didn't go away, huh? Gibraltar became British in 1716 or 1713 at the Peace of Utrecht. It didn't go away. They still want Gibraltar back. Yeah, and he was emotional about it. He became angry about it. After 300 years, what are you talking about? It didn't go away. Kosovo Poje. In Kosovo, it doesn't go away for the Serbs. For the French, their disastrous battles against the British in the 14th century, they lost. Doesn't go away. It doesn't play a role anymore, but it's still there. And if you cannot touch upon it, cannot connect with the participants, then I think your seminar will not be successful. So in essence, I think, no, there's no change.
All right, but how about some large multilateral negotiations where the issue of managing complexity is very important? When we have so many participants, so many problems, don't you see any new attempts to approach these kinds of very big scale negotiations?
Well, there are new attempts in the sense that we try to create more effectiveness. For example, if you look at the European Union, it is not allowed to take the floor for each country. Countries will have to form alliances, and on behalf of the alliance, somebody will speak. So you have maybe 3 speakers or 4 speakers, but not 27 speakers. So we try to do something about that. In NATO, they tried also to have something like that, but it didn't work. So we try to create more effectiveness, stronger secretariats, but stronger secretariats also means more interest for the organization itself. The interest of the organization might not be in line with the interest of the member states. So you get all kinds of extra complications. Also, and that's really problematic. Countries don't want to have strong international organizations. They need international organizations, but they should not be too strong, because then they might be an obstacle, especially for the powers, not for the small countries. Small countries, it's good. For the big powers, they also see them as a handicap. And this is why, they selected Mr. Waldheim as the Secretary General of the Security Council of the United Nations, because they knew he committed atrocities on the Balkans in the Second World War. So the powers knew that they could blackmail him. So we have Mr. Rutte. We always said he's now Secretary General of NATO. We always said when he was Prime Minister in the Netherlands, he doesn't have a view, he doesn't have a vision. That's exactly why they have him as the Secretary General of NATO. They wouldn't like to have a strong person like Tony Blair as the president of the European Union. You take 2 Belgians already, you take people who can be molded, right? So that is a strange thing that we do not like to have international organizations that are so strong, but we need them in order to have more or less effective negotiation processes. What is much more important is context. In which context will we have the climate change negotiation, for example? right?
Mm.
Is that the world context that is negative about everything that it will cost to do something about climate change, or positive because people realize that they want to do something about it? And then the problem is long-term against short-term. Short-term, it's costly. Long-term, we will all die if we don't do something now, but now the politicians have to deal with their constituency and they don't want to burden their constituency too much. So context. As very interesting that there's a famous Chinese general who was also very interesting for negotiation, Sun Tzu. And Sun Tzu defined strategy as strategy is to change a situation in such a way that it will be right for your victory. Meaning that the conflict, the problem, is the outcome of the context. If you don't change the context first, you can never have a negotiated outcome, right? And that's exactly the problem in the Middle East. There is no overarching organization because they cannot have a compromise on that. And because there's no overarching organization, negotiation doesn't really help. Like in East Asia, there is no connection between the Chinese side, let's say, and the Japanese side. And if there's no overarching organization, more or less like NATO for the Atlantic, then you cannot protect these negotiation processes. And if there is a conflict, then it might be war. And that's very sad that we cannot deal with issues like, for example, Palestine, Israel. Although it's good that we have the criminal court in The Hague, so we try to do something about multilateral institutions that might correct the situation. But in the end, it's about context. Context will determine the process and the outcome.
Member of the steering committee of the process of international negotiation program. And PIN has published a lot of books about the power in international negotiations.
Yeah.
So relationship between less powerful and more powerful countries. Do you see any dynamics in relationship between smaller or less powerful or developing countries on the one hand and more powerful countries on the other hand, taking into account that international organizations are perhaps very good framework for, first of all, for smaller countries. It gives them rules which is good for them. But do you see that now small countries are effectively using these opportunities, or there is nothing in this power balance between them?
First of all, power is a relative thing. The United States has much more structural power than Israel, but Mr. Netanyahu has Mr. Biden in his pocket. Children are very effective negotiators. The power is with the parents who have a car and who have a salary, who have a house. But if they love the children, then in that case, the children can blackmail the more powerful ones. It's exactly what Netanyahu is doing. It's exactly why small countries like the Netherlands are in the European Union, because now Brussels cannot overlook them. They have the rightful place, and if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And so we need, as small countries, we need these kind of international structures. I always pleaded for more cooperation, but who am I, between the Central Asian countries. Because if you don't have more cooperation between the Central Asian countries, the Russians, the Chinese, and the Iranians will take the spoils. This is what they understood in Switzerland. If we don't stick together, although we have German speakers, French speakers, Italian speakers, Rätoroman, although we have Catholics and Protestants, although we have very expensive agriculture, although we don't have seaports, but if we don't stick together, then we will be taken by the surrounding countries. So Central Asia, but also Caucasus, South Caucasus, if you don't manage your conflicts, the third parties will take the spoils, and not just only the very powerful one, but anyway. So the BRICS tried to do something about that. And what you see now with the BRICS is that it works exactly like the Security Council, because the original 5 can veto any other country that wants to become a member, right? So India said Pakistan should not be a member. Well, Pakistan is an important country. It does have nuclear power, so you should have them at the table. And India said, "Niet." Well, there you are. I mean, you see that even in the global south, they are organizing themselves now, like in the Security Council with the five, or like in Vienna after the Napoleon lost the wars, there were also 5 countries being decisive. After the First World War in Versailles, also 5 countries. Something with the 5 most powerful, who will then try to dominate the others. But they cannot fully dominate them. And why not? Because the powers themselves are often at odds with each other. So they need the small countries to support them. And this is a chance for the smaller countries, that they are playing a role. After all, in Security Council, you need 9 out of 15 votes to adopt a resolution, meaning that you have the 5 veto powers, but they still need 4 small countries to agree to a resolution. In that sense, the 4 small countries also have veto power. So small countries have a chance. It's very difficult because we are with so many, and with the more countries you have, the more complex it is, the more difficult it is to have a joint strategy. But on the other hand, we have flexibility, right? And so we should use that. What do you need then, as being a small country? You need effective negotiators. This is why we are training them. You need to have allies. Although it's sometimes on one issue and not on the other one, but you're competing on one, you're collaborating on another. You need to negotiate in the situation right for you. In that sense, the Israelis have been very smart just before, and this might be a coincidence, just before the elections in the United States. That context gives them an opportunity. So the smaller you are, the more you have to look for opportunities, the more art is involved, the more creativity is involved. And small countries like Liechtenstein at a certain moment in negotiations in Europe between East and West can be very, very, very influential if they have a legitimate ambassador. If she or he is good and can be trusted and is predictable, then in that sense, even very small countries, or maybe exactly small countries, can be very effective. Look at Luxembourg, right? So we have our chances. We have to be more creative. We have to look for allies, but we also have to look for inroads into the powerful states. The Armenians have their diaspora. They don't have oil and gas, but they have their diaspora. The Israelis have their diaspora in Washington. If you cannot influence a government from the outside, influence them from the inside. So there are many, many opportunities. If we are willing to use them, I think sometimes, yes, small countries can be more effective than bigger countries. You go into Iraq, you go into Afghanistan, you think you can control Afghanistan? Who was the loser? NATO. Who was the winner? The Taliban, because they knew the situation. And anyway, how can you do that? Because Alexander the Great couldn't fully control Bactria, Afghanistan. The Brits were thrown out. The Soviets were thrown out. How do you think, being the Americans, you can control that? What is that? What is stupidity?
Very interesting. You just mentioned the importance of negotiation skills, especially for diplomats from small countries. It's very important for them to be successful in diplomacy.
Yeah.
But on the one hand, imagine very skillful negotiator from a small country.
No.
But on the other hand, big power, structural power of large countries.
Yeah.
So do I understand you correctly that even in such a situation, negotiation skill has a very big importance and it could make a change?
Yeah, well, if you look at the question, so where does the word negotiation comes from? It comes from Latin, and it comes from nec otium. And nec otium means nec is no, and otium is being idle, not doing anything. So it is doing something. And what is it? It is trading. It is trying to create value. That's what negotiation is about. Now, the problem with small and bigger countries is that bigger countries tend to negotiate, as we call it, distributive, in the sense of a win-lose negotiation. Well, for small countries, integrative negotiation is important, creating value on both sides, if possible, but maybe one side will get more than the other one, but still, without the negotiation, we wouldn't have created that value. So for negotiators of small countries, that's difficult because they have to try to influence the other one in such a way that you move from this win-lose negotiation to a kind of win-win negotiation. At the same time, you might become more and more dependent on the other one. And this is how Talleyrand, I already talked about him, tried to influence the ones who were victorious in Vienna, because France lost, tried to influence them by having them at the table. And he had them at the table in Vienna because he took the best cook of Paris, Carême, with him. Everybody wanted to be at his table, and then you can influence them. So here it is more than negotiation. Here, this kind of tacit negotiation, what you analyze, is also coming around. It's creating a context that will be ripe for your success. And if you don't have that context, being a small country, if you don't create it in one way or another, it will be very, very difficult to be successful. So in a way, small countries need more effective negotiators. Big countries, if the negotiator is not effective, so what? They're powerful enough.
Very interesting. So you just mentioned the so-called tacit negotiations. As you know, Thomas Schelling introduced this concept, and he was talking about the so-called explicit bargaining and negotiation, and also tacit bargaining and negotiation. So do you think the tacit negotiation has a big role in diplomatic relations? How can we train diplomats to be effective tacit bargainers or tacit negotiators, as well as explicit?
By training them in thinking geopolitically, understanding context. Therefore, understanding that that there might be context change under certain circumstances, and that then they have to grab the opportunity, and that often it doesn't help to negotiate or whatever before you have a context, create a context that is ripe for you. So an example is, for example, after Karabakh again, that the Aliyevs wanted to take southern Armenia because then they have a direct connection with Turkey. The Iranians said, no way, you can have Karabakh, you can't have southern Armenia, because this means that we Iranians cannot go to Russia overland. And so they put together a strong army, the Iranians, and they supported the Christian Armenians against their own Shiite brothers in Azerbaijan. If you don't understand these shifts in the context, then you are nowhere with your negotiation process. So I think it's very important that through a training in negotiation, you try to influence the thinking of the negotiators in such a way that they will think in a contextual way. And I always say, I'm not teaching. When I'm teaching, it's not theory and then we are going to practice. No, we are practicing, and through practicing we might understand theory. So if I have an opportunity to influence the thinking of, for example, at the moment, the Hungarian diplomats in Budapest, of Mr. Orban, I will do that. And I was training Assad's diplomats till 2011 when the whole thing went wrong. Then you stop, of course. And I've been at Guimont for a long time. Of course, I'm not going there anymore. But you try to influence the brains of the students being there, because that is, in a way, the only possibility to get them to understand what they should do, and more importantly, what they should not do.
Interesting. Can we say that diplomats could affect or create context with narratives, with storytelling.
Yeah, for sure. Storytelling is very important. I use this in my seminars. I give examples all the time, as I'm doing now, because without stories, without narratives, without examples, you won't catch it, you won't get it. But they are the servant of the overall view, of the holistic view. But you need them because otherwise it's too abstract. And that is, of course, one of these problems, also in negotiation training, this divide between those who are the thinkers about it and those who are the practitioners. And you seldomly see people who are both Kissinger, Harold Nicholson, but also Catherine Ashton, for example, who recently wrote a book, and she was the first Prime Minister of Foreign Affairs of the European Union. She wrote a book, and then what? And that book is about her experiences in negotiation, but then she's thinking about it, contemplating about it, and trying to get an answer, to get a lesson. What are the lessons learned? She analyzes her own negotiation process. Problem is most practitioners, most diplomats don't do that. They only have examples or whatever, but they don't have a kind of synergetic view. Well, academics do have a synergetic view, but they have not been negotiators often. And there are a few exceptions here. Another one is Robert Cooper, who was negotiating, mediating, a British guy on behalf of the European Union, and who recently wrote the book, The Ambassadors. And we need these people who can do both, like you, who are academics, who also understand practice.
Very interesting.
May I just say a few words about the cover of the dissertation? And
Yes.
if somebody would like to have the dissertation, they can send an email to you or to me or whatever, because I have it online, so they can get it for free. And in the meantime, it's sold out, and well, you can get it secondhand if you're lucky, but it's not so easy.
I believe you could download it free on
yes. Yeah, if you go to Clingendael Institute and you go to the Clingendael website, you'll find it there. But I'd like to say something about briefly about the book and the cover, because the cover is the book and vice versa. And the book is about the question of when could negotiation be effective? And my central thesis is it can be effective if it's protected by international institutions, because negotiation is very vulnerable. And if you don't protect it with systems, it might not work. It's more easy to go to war sometimes than to start a viable negotiation process, as we see with Ukraine and Russia at the moment, and the Palestinians and the Israelis. So this is my main thesis in the book. That's actually my dissertation. But if you look at the cover, it's a very interesting cover. The cover is from the inventor of the candid camera. And this is in the 20s and the 30s. Now, candid camera in the 20s or the 30s, that's an enormous monstrum, of course. But he was always hiding it behind plans and things like that. And this picture is a picture of failed negotiations between the French and the Germans in Lausanne, in Switzerland. So they were negotiating about how much money the Germans had to pay to the French. And this is 1932, 1 year before Hitler grabbed power. And what is interesting there is, for example, Hitler's second in command is there still Reichskanzler of Germany. And if you turn the book around, you can see the Reichskanzler sitting there, von Papen, next to the French Prime Minister, Herriot. And you'll see them sitting together at the backside of the book while they're not looking at each other. The negotiations failed, so the British Prime Minister invited them to his hotel room in Lausanne, and after dinner. So everybody has dinner attire on, etc. And the atmosphere is both very tense and very relaxed. And I think that's typical for informal negotiation, secret negotiation, back channel negotiation, this combination of being tense because what's going to happen, but being relaxed because why should the Brits be relaxed? They're chairing again, they're mediating again.
Right.
Whatever comes out of it, they need stability on the continent. And so you see the prime minister smoking a cigar. Everybody's smoking at the time. Nobody knew that this picture was taken. The only one who knew about it, and it's just on the small part of the cover, is a young assistant of the Berlin embassy of the UK, and who later on became Minister of Foreign Affairs, Foreign Office in London. Now, what is dramatic about it is that the one who took the picture was a German, but he was Jewish. And so he had to flee to Netherlands when Hitler came to power. And so he did. And then he was in hiding in The Hague. And then he was betrayed by some kind of Dutch civil servant in the town hall. And so they took him and his wife, and they were killed in Auschwitz. The son of him, his son, fled to the UK, to Britain, and became a Nazi hunter and changed his name from Erich Salomon, to Hunter. And came to me after his father died at Clingendael and offered me this black and white picture. And then I used it for the book. And just by coincidence, his wife was still alive in The Hague. And 1 year before she died, I visited her and I offered her the book. So there's a whole story behind both.
Paul, what do you think? What can other negotiators, for example, from business, can learn from diplomats, from diplomatic negotiators? And what diplomatic negotiators can learn from other negotiators, for example, from business people? Anything they could learn from each other?
Yeah, because negotiation is negotiation after all. I think business people can learn that you have to try to think more or less long term, not only short term. That you have to be flexible, that constructive ambiguity sometimes is necessary. And culture, of course, understanding the culture of the other party. On the other hand, I think diplomats can learn from business negotiations to be more businesslike, to be more decisive. Diplomats are often avoiding in negotiation. Right. You see this with groups. If you apply a certain self-assessment to them, you see that diplomatic groups are very high on avoidance. With avoidance, you don't move forward. So I think that's what diplomats can learn from business. On the other hand, you cannot just apply business ideas, business negotiation to diplomatic ones like Harvard did. I mean, that's my criticism of Harvard negotiation project, and that's also Chris Voss's criticism. You cannot just say, we can now act like in business and let's be open about our interests, and so we will have a deal and it will be soon a very good deal. Try to do that with Vladimir Putin, right? So there are certain things that don't work, but we can still learn from each other. Diplomats being more decisive, and otherwise you don't have progress, and businesses to take more care of relationships.
All right. Do you expect any new big ideas could appear in the field of negotiation and also in diplomatic negotiations? Something big
there you
ideas,
so my
changing.
My answer is pas du tout, huh? No, no, I don't. I think that we were very weak in negotiation 50 years ago. Although the French were the first ones, of course, to write about negotiation, to try to create concepts. François de Carrière, his book in English on the manner of negotiating with princes, is still relevant to diplomatic negotiators.
It's still the best book in diplomacy.
It's still the best book in diplomacy. La manière de négocier avec les souverains, how to deal with the sovereigns, the dynasties. And in a way, nothing changed. Technology changed. But for the rest, not much changed. And in the last 50 years, starting with the Americans and then Europeans and then others, this is why we are writing a book a year with the PIN group. we got more insight into important aspects like power, human behavior, things like that. But I don't see really new developments. No, the main point is and remains: when is a situation ripe for a negotiation? When is negotiation ripe for an outcome? And what is the connection between war and negotiation? And how could we do something about it? International law is coming in now. And even if Netanyahu will not be taken to the court in The Hague, it does have an impact on him. It does have an impact on Vladimir Putin. Of course, the Mongolians who are member of the court did not deliver Mr. Putin to the court in The Hague when Putin visited Mongolia a few weeks ago. I mean, yeah, a small country, you just cannot do that, and everybody understands it. Still, it has a moral impact on them. They are so proud. They have such a huge ego, as normally successful negotiators, successful politicians have. Their ego, this is not good for their ego. And so I think that the court coming up, although it's of course quite helpless, is an important new aspect. But in the end, international law will be overrun by politics anyway. In the end, it's all political. It's all about power. We can try to moderate it a bit, but I think that's it in principle. So no, I don't think there will be very many new developments.
But how about some ideas like game theory, or some ideas from quantum physics, or quantum ideas?
But that might work if you have facts.
Could they enrich negotiation thinking and practice?
Yeah, so you have the fact and figures, then you can calculate the outcome of a negotiation between trade union, and a company, for example. But this is simple. In diplomatic negotiation, the problem is not only different processes, different issues, but many different people. Because they have different characters. It makes a hell of a difference if you have Monsieur Chirac, or you have Tony Blair, or you have Silvio Berlusconi. You cannot calculate that. Of course, you can use artificial intelligence to get a better idea about the complexity of the negotiation, to pick up your priorities, because your priorities, that's important to you. And what are your lesser priorities as maybe potential concessions? And then you still have to make them. You still will have to be ready to give up part of Ukraine, so part land for peace. And what will the peace be? And how will the peace look like after the deal? How can we still protect Ukraine? That is even more of a problem. And so I don't think that modern developments will, in the end, help us to really deal with the nucleus of negotiations between states. That is still, I think, people's business. But I'm an old guy, and maybe I'm old-fashioned, and so maybe I'm wrong.
All right. So I have a last question, if you don't mind. As we mentioned, you visited 100 countries to provide negotiation trainings, mostly for diplomats and young diplomats. You've seen a lot of them, and you taught many of them. What advice can you give to young diplomats in terms of improving their negotiation skills, knowledge, approach?
Well, first of all, do some reading, of course, and keep track of political developments in the world and how people analyze them, how they look at it. And then try to overcome your cultural bias, that if you think that your group is holy and all the other groups are, well, should not use undiplomatic expression. But if you go on with in-group, out-group thinking, which is also happening in Europe, Hungary, for example, but even more in Central Asia, even more in other parts of the world. My group is good. Your group is bad. Whatever my group does is okay. Whatever your group does is bad. If you are not overcoming that divide, and that is very difficult, has to do with your own culture that will determine your vision, your perception of the world. But if you cannot be, if you're not ready to understand the perception of others, then it will not be easy to have an effective negotiation process. Perception determines reality, as I said, and to understand the perception, for example, of people in Uzbekistan who are living in the Central Asian environment, yeah, there are your enemies, of course. For example, for the Israelis, there are the Hamas as the enemy. But if you go on rejecting them, well, you cannot detach yourself in the end from the Palestinians, who are Semitic anyway themselves, then you will never get there. So you have to look for common ground, or you have to create common ground, because to work together in a peaceful way is not only in their interest, it's also in your interest. This means that the moderates will have to gain power, but normally the extremists are much better at gaining power than the moderates. And so this is what we are going to be faced with. And let's see how we can survive this coming era with Trump and Yeltsin, and Putin, and see how can we survive this. And maybe after that create a world of better communication, more negotiation, more working together. There are always currents, and the currents in history that are negative for cooperation and the currents that are positive. The only problem is that to start working together often only happens after a major disaster. And we don't want that disaster to happen.
Right. Well, Paul, you have outlined very extreme complexity of the whole diplomatic negotiation process, diplomacy, especially in current world. Unfortunately, we have so many very bad problems around, but your insights are very, very important, and your expertise is absolutely essential and very useful. Thank you so much for your time and for your insights.
You're welcome, and let's go on working together, because that's the only useful thing we can do. Thank you, Alisher.
Thank you so much.